Hey everybody, Professor Benelu with the second of two videos showing you what is expected in the Unit 4 discussion board. This video is going to be going over the 4 topics that you may choose from, okay? Remember, you are analyzing a primary document. So in the Reaganomics case, you are analyzing an interview that Reagan gave regarding Reaganomics and the Economic Recovery Tax Act. So Reagan was sworn into office in January of 1981. His goal was to make sure that every American had more spending money in their pockets. So in an attempt to do this, he instituted an economic program that was called Reaganomics. Reaganomics, basically the gist of it is cut the taxes for the wealthy, and the wealth will trickle down to the lower and middle classes. Okay. To really gauge the success of Reaganomics, you have to look at how lower middle classes fared during his time in office. We're going to get into that. Okay, so Reagan was a big proponent of smaller government, so he felt that the middle class would benefit from more simplified tax codes. He cut $41 billion from the federal budget, which is a lot. A lot of that had funding was for social programs. Supply side economics is another important aspect of Reaganomics. Belief that cutting taxes for businesses will benefit the middle class and will trickle down to the lower and middle classes. Okay, the Tax Equity and Responsibility Act closed tax loopholes and restricted benefits in pension plans. This was Reagan's way of dealing with the deficit without raising taxes. Okay, it helped out somewhat, but didn't help out as much as we had hoped. Okay, as had been hoped. And I'm sorry, I forgot what I called the Tax Act before, but it's the Tax Equity and Responsibility Act. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow during the Reagan years. Reagan did not increase the minimum wage during his presidency, and federal funding for things like firefighters, policemen, and education were all cut during his term in office. The two hardest hit by Reagan during Reagan's time in office by Reaganomics is single mother and African American households. They saw the biggest decline in income. 84, Reagan further slashed tax rates for the wealthy and caused an even larger federal deficit. The nation's deficit would really grow during his second term in office because of his focus on military and defense spending, particularly his Star Wars program. Okay, so that is the Reaganomics portion. The first Gulf War portion. Of course, the background to the first Gulf War. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded and took over Kuwait. Kuwait, as we know, is a very oil-rich nation to this day. President George H.W. Bush had served 8 years as Reagan's vice president. He was elected president of the United States in November 1988. He, of course, immediately demanded the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Saudi Arabia became the base for United Nations coalition forces. And what's important to note, my dear students, is the United States headed up the United Nations coalition forces, and Saudi Arabia became their base. And the Saudis allowed the UN coalition forces to come into their country and use it as a base because the Saudis were afraid that while the Iraqis were taking over Kuwait, they would be next. So anyway, and Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq at the time, he dared to invade and take over Kuwait because the U.S. had been so friendly to the Iraqis for so many years. He felt that the U.S. would really not intervene. Well, he miscalculated big time. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though coalition forces won the war, Saddam Hussein remained in power. Okay, he would remain in power for another 12 years. And it's interesting because a lot of people criticize former President George H.W. Bush. You should have taken Saddam Hussein out of power in 1991. Excuse me. Well, think about it this way, everybody. The Middle East has always been an unstable area of the world. And excuse me, if Saddam Hussein had been ousted from power back in 1991, you would have created a power vacuum in an unstable area of the world and made it even more unstable. So that wouldn't have been a good thing. Anyway, President George H.W. Bush, you'll be analyzing his speech in front of the United Nations General Assembly on October 1st, 1990. This speech occurred just a little over 2 months after Iraq invaded and took over Kuwait. During this speech, he condemned the Iraqi aggression and called on the members of the United Nations to return Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. He said that the United Nations can aid nations to come together to prevent aggression and punish those responsible. So, very important. That is the first Gulf War topic. The third topic you may choose from is the rise of conservatism. Pat Buchanan, he was a conservative commentator, and he had been a contender for the Republican nomination in 1992, but of course lost out to President George H.W. Bush, who was running for re-election. August 17, 1992, Buchanan gave a speech at the re-election campaign for President George H.W. Bush at the Republican National Convention. In this speech, he discusses what he calls a culture war. What is the culture war he's referring to? What are the topics of debate that he's discussing? And what is the conservative opinion on that? Are these still topics of debate today? Look into it. He then states how George H.W. Bush is the right man to lead the nation through its current difficulties. Okay, so look into that. The very last topic that you can go over is the Tear Down This Wall speech. This is an absolutely famous, iconic speech by President Ronald Reagan that he gave in June of 1987 in front of the Berlin Wall. During this speech, he said that the Cold War needed to end, with democracy spreading through those nations that were formerly under communist rule. And he emphasized the hardships that Berliners had had since the wall had been built in 1961. And he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The dismantling of the wall began in November 1989 with the collapse of the East German government. You have to look at why the East German government collapsed. The East German government was basically on the decline, and the economy in East Germany was on the decline for several years before the collapse. Soviet Premier Gorbachev urged the East Germans to impose economic reforms like glasnost and perestroika that he had done in the Soviet Union. East Germans were flocking to embassies requesting to be let into West Germany. November of 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker resigned, and East Germans were officially allowed into West Germany. And that ended communism in East Germany and officially reunited the two Germanys. Okay? I hope these two videos have helped. Please feel free to contact me if you have absolutely any questions on any of the topics or anything regarding this assignment. All right, everybody, you can do this. Let's get this done.